Xtalks connects professionals in the life science, medical device, and food industries with useful content like webinars, job openings, articles, and virtual meetings to help you succeed in your career. This food industry-focused podcast brings together some of our editorial staff to share insights into the latest B2B industry news to help keep you up to date. This week on the show, we're discussing a new Netflix food documentary exposing America's faulty food safety system and a series of recent Trader Joe's recalls. Enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Xtalks Food Podcast. I'm Sydney Perlmutter, Senior Food Industry Journalist and Webinar Moderator at Xtalks.com, and this week I'm joined by Aisha Rashid, Vera Kovacevic, and Sarah Hand. Thanks for coming today. So I'm going to start us off with a story about Trader Joe's, and they're under fire for some recalls, and now multiple of which happened in the span of 1 week. So if you haven't heard of Trader Joe's, it's a American grocer and retailer, and they're kind of known for selling like small batch and their own branded products that have gained a cult-like following. And here in Canada, we do not have Trader Joe's, but often people will cross the border just for a Trader Joe's grocery haul. And the ones that I've been to were awesome, and they had really cool products. However, they've gained attention in the last week for all the wrong reasons, because the popular retail chain declared 3 different product recalls during the last week of July. So the recalls affect cookies, broccoli cheddar soup, and falafel, which raised concerns over possible contamination with foreign objects like insects or rocks. So the Trader Joe's recall has raised some eyebrows, with food safety experts calling it a serious concern. Melvin Kramer, who's the president of EHA Environmental and Public Health Consulting Group, told Vox that the situation is truly very problematic. It emphasizes the vulnerability of the procedures meant to safeguard our food supply from causing health issues, or as Kramer calls it, the yuck factor. The Trader Joe's recall appears to be a voluntary move, which is a common practice amongst companies facing contaminated food products. And I forget how long ago it was, but we actually talked about what voluntary recalls actually mean and whether they're actually voluntary. And long story short, no, they're still forced to actually recall them. And if they don't, the FDA will step in and they'll be penalized. So just remember that when you think of voluntary recalls. So the U.S. government's oversight largely entrusts food safety assurance to private companies, which incentivizes them to tackle food safety issues proactively to maintain customer trust and profitability. However, the complexity of ensuring food safety grows as our food system continues to globalize. The exact reasons for these close-knit recalls remain unclear. Questions surrounding the impacts of globalization and the relative absence of federal food oversight on the contamination of goods have emerged. Recalls usually point to one or another. But according to Kramer, it could be an unfortunate series of events. So Trader Joe's, in a statement to Vox, called the series of recalls a coincidence. Yet Kramer suggests another theory. So he thought that the unique appeal of Trader Joe's to consumers lies in its blend of global and local foods produced by small-scale makers. So this variety may increase Trader Joe's recall risk compared to stores sourcing from large-scale manufacturers. And to me, that made the most sense. As an American food retailer operating over 500 stores nationwide, Trader Joe's, like I said, has gained a cult-like following for selling a variety of local specialty foods and crafting engaging narratives about its brand. However, the recent increase in Trader Joe's recall from once or twice a month to 3 times in a week is pretty alarming. So the Food Safety and Inspection Service, or FSIS, and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, oversee food safety in the U.S., albeit with different levels of scrutiny. And just so you know, the FSIS is governed by the USDA. So the FSIS continuously inspects meat and egg products, while the FDA is responsible for around 80% of the U.S. food supply, inspects manufacturers once every 3 to 5 years, so not very often. This disparity means that most issues within the food disparity means that most issues with the food, the FDA supervisors are only caught when a consumer or manufacturer notices a problem. To me, it should not be that way. So when food safety issues do arise, the reaction can significantly affect a company's profits and, of course, the public trust. And as a result, food distributors like Trader Joe's often hire independent companies to verify their suppliers' safety practices. However, the responsibility lies with the retailer to set the food safety standards their suppliers must meet. Trader Joe's, obviously, it sets itself apart from other grocery chains because I can't really think of another grocery store that has sort of a following like this for the reasons that it does, by offering, smaller local companies. And these companies may lack the sophistication, unfortunately, of larger enterprises, thereby possibly increasing the risk of a recall. However, the retailer emphasizes that it only purchases products from FDA or USDA licensed and approved manufacturing facilities that adhere to widely accepted food quality assurance systems. According to Kramer, the demand for unique and often out-of-season foods can also contribute to food safety risks. For example, the year-round demand for raspberries in the U.S. has led to increased international imports, introducing new health risks like this gastrointestinal parasite called Cyclospora. And as our food system becomes more complex with globalization, the risk of, a Trader Joe's recall or similar food safety issue increases. And in our global food system, consumers are becoming more demanding, which can inevitably lead to higher risks. So, I don't ever want to blame the consumer. Obviously, it's not an individual's consumer's fault. And we'll get into this with the next story. But I really do wonder, our consumers and just our demand, are we sort of partially to blame, or should we not even ask that question because it's so not the responsibility of consumers to ensure that our food is safe to eat? Personally, I do not think it's consumers' faults, and I think hearing about how little or how few times that the FDA actually inspects manufacturers is pretty shocking. 3 to 5 years is not a lot. But yeah, what is your take on, this sort of increase in recalls, especially for one manufacturer?
Yeah, it is pretty eye-opening. And, food recalls have become so ubiquitous now, like, sad to say. Like, it's you just hear about them all the time. And I don't know whether it's just because consumers are more aware, or maybe some of the manufacturers are doing more testing of their own as well. But it's both good to see, but also problematic just to see, right? Because you're uncovering a lot of the issues in food safety in the U.S. And so I'm looking forward to your next story, but like, the U.S. often deems that it has the safest food supply in the world and all of that kind of stuff. But I mean, like, seeing just the growing number of recalls, it's very problematic. And then, yeah, I was very surprised to hear that, regulations around inspections, it's like, what, once every 3 to 5 years? Like, how does that even work? And I think a lot of these regulations are so outdated, and definitely we need to be pushing for updates to regulatory, to regulations around food safety. And the other thing I was going to say is that, yeah, supply and demand, right? Like, your question, I had never thought about it that way. And it's a very interesting question, Sydney, that, are consumers driving demand for certain products? And so does that put pressure on these companies to deliver? Well, no one's holding a knife like to their neck to, produce or deliver certain like these products. So I would say, kind of shifting blame to consumers wouldn't be the way to go. I think it really, the onus is more on the manufacturers and then the regulatory bodies that should be doing a better job to regulate them.
Yeah, there's something interesting here too, in that Trader Joe's, a lot of their products are white label, right? So they're branded as like Trader Joe's almond windmill cookies, Trader Joe's ready to eat falafel. I mean, they don't have a one giant factory that's pumping out both cookies and falafel. They're contracting this out to other suppliers of these things, other manufacturers who would create these white label goods. So even though I know Trader Joe's said they said the series of recalls are a coincidence, I wonder if there is a common denominator here, a common supplier, or if it really is a coincidence. I'm seeing that at least 2 of the recalls are due to the potential contamination of rocks, which let's all just like pause for a moment and acknowledge that rocks. Like, I think it yeah. Wow. And it's interesting to think, like, so where did that happen?
And insects, too, right?
Yeah, the insects.
More edible, at least.
Yeah, the insects piece to me is more like...
yeah, I suppose.
But,
But that could be...
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that could be like an infestation at like a production facility, or, what is that, right? And to your point, Sarah, I do agree. Like, there are probably ingredients that they're maybe sourcing from the same manufacturer for some of these products.
Yeah.
And so, and I wonder, are they, like, at what point do they disclose that? Or are they able to disclose
I don't know.
that?
I think normally on these products, like, if you liken them to store branded products, so if you buy something that's a store brand, even from a grocery store, I mean, we're talking from a Canadian perspective. So if we're thinking of like President's Choice as a store brand, I think if you were to look at the back of the package, you could see who it's made by, like, for President's Choice. Do they have to disclose that?
But I mean, like, in terms of like individual products, like, let's say, I'm thinking about the next story, but like peanut paste or something, or the wheat or the sugar. So they're all supplied by different manufacturers.
Then you don't have that level of visibility, at least from the consumer perspective. Yeah, you're 100% right. Yeah. And I wonder if that is more like the rocks makes me think more that is a supplier problem. There's some ingredient that's come in, it's had rocks in it, and then that's gone on to be used to produce the cookies or the falafel or whatever the case may be. I totally agree with you. And I think something we've talked about before on this podcast is that just the fact that, like, a recall's put out there, everyone's made aware. Hopefully anybody who has these products in their home takes them back or throws them out or whatever the case may be. But the fact that there's very little sort of reporting after the fact, like, how did that happen? I'm sure there's tons of internal investigations into, well, how did rocks end up in this product? But we're just like not always, or not maybe ever made privy to that. And I think, like, from our perspective at least, that can be kind of maddening, because it's just like such a question of, well, how did this actually happen,
You might eventually see it on an expose or like a Netflix documentary years and years later. So.
And that is an excellent segue into my next story. So maybe some of our listeners have watched it or heard of it, but Netflix stirred the pot once again with one of their thrilling documentaries, and this one was quite an insightful expose. So the streaming service plunged into the world of food safety with its newest food documentary called Poisoned: The Dirty Truth About Your Food, which promises to answer viewers' perception about everyday foods and their origins. So the objective of the documentary is not to dictate what foods the audience should avoid due to health concerns or to debunk myths about so-called healthy foods, but rather its primary focus is to shed light on the negligent food safety practices employed by various companies and federal authorities. So in a way, this food documentary serves as an informative public service announcement. This documentary came out on August 2nd, and it offers a very engaging and sometimes stomach-churning narrative. So here's what you need to know about Poisoned: The Dirty Truth About Your Food. So the film, in fact, unpacks a variety of food safety issues, starting with the notorious E. coli outbreak between 1992 and 1993 that very sadly claimed the lives of 4 children who had eaten contaminated burgers from the fast food chain Jack in the Box, and one of whom, unfortunately, actually didn't even eat the burger, but I think obtained E. coli from a daycare, a child who had E. coli at the daycare, or it was something like that, and that was even more upsetting, honestly. And it was a very heart-wrenching event that prompted an increased focus on fast food safety regulations. But the documentary argued, of course, that more regulatory work is still needed even after all of this time. And the spotlight frequently fell on corporate executives and government regulators in the documentary, and these being the usual suspects behind food contamination. Attorney Bill Marler, who represented one of the victims from the Jack in the Box incident, as well as many others, and started his crusade against weak food regulation, was prominently featured throughout the film and noted in the trailer. Sometimes the manufacturers of food don't think of it as food. It becomes a commodity. So the film also profiled Kenneth Kendrick, who is a former plant manager at Peanut Corporation of America. Kendrick made headlines when he blew the whistle on his boss, corporation owner Stuart Parnell, for tampering with inspection records to ship out contaminated peanuts. Parnell was subsequently convicted and sentenced to 28 years in federal prison in 2014. The narrative unfolds through several other viewpoints, including those of food industry attorneys, politicians, regulators, scientists, victims' parents, and implicated businesses. These interviews offer an accessible and profoundly disturbing recollection of the events. A critical revelation of the documentary is the convoluted nature of the regulatory infrastructure, which we kind of touched on in the last story. So agencies like the USDA and FDA seem to be in a tug of war with ambiguous and overlapping jurisdictions over specific products. Additionally, the regulations in place lack the necessary rigor to enforce safety effectively and predictably. Lobbyists are pushing to maintain the status quo. The documentary delves into several other cases, unmasking the conflict between public health and corporate avarice. Although politicians often tout the U.S. as having the safest food safety system in the world, as Aisha touched on, this food documentary implies otherwise. It was directed by Stephanie Sochtig, I believe her name is, known for her previous work, Fed Up, which explored American obesity. The documentary takes inspiration from the book by the journalist Jeff Benedict called Poisoned, the True Story of the Deadly E. coli Outbreak That Changed the Way Americans Eat. So I had watched the documentary the night before writing this, so it was very fresh in my mind, and obviously I couldn't touch on everything, but I think, I'll point out some moments that sort of shocked me the most. And that was, we often hear about how unsafe and prone to contamination that leafy greens are. And I kind of always assumed that it was just because they had such a high water content and they were more prone to sort of just naturally developing foodborne illnesses, which is somewhat part of it, but the major part of it was that often the water that is watering the plants while they're growing can be contaminated with animal waste that itself is has some sort of foodborne illness in it, and how few steps there were to sort of actually. There are very few steps and regulations in place to sort of that in those in between steps. So no one's really looking out for the testing the water. And in the interviews with the USDA and the FDA, they kind of they're giving like non-answers. They're basically just saying, oh, we don't have jurisdiction over this, or and they're kind of like going back and forth, and it honestly, this documentary made them look really like uninformed about their own positions, and they were two pretty high up people in both of these organizations, and it was a very bad look for them, in my opinion. And I think we also have to acknowledge that documentaries, much like any piece of media, are media at the end of the day, and I'm sure we were just seeing the worst of the worst. However, after over 3 years of writing about food and just doing my own research after the fact, I did not get a positive impression from these representatives, as well as the food companies who have been who have done horrible things in the past, like the Peanut Corporation of America and Jack in the Box. So it was an extremely eye-opening documentary, especially when it came to foodborne illnesses and a couple specific products. But yeah, I mean, I'll sort of ask the question in a different way, but, in terms of, the USDA and the FDA, like, these are allegedly very trusted authorities that we sort of, not here in Canada, but in the US, where they have hundreds of millions of people to feed, we kind of don't really have another option, right? But to trust them but after sort of hearing how little they actually knew about their own authorities, it was very shocking. So, I mean, do you think that other agencies could sort of do a better job, or do you think that, private agencies, or should the government really be the ones responsible for this, even after so many years of messing up and just having poor authority?
Okay, so I watched the documentary a couple of days ago, and I have a lot to say. I'm going to hold back, though, on a lot of it, but it was so eye-opening. And Sydney, you were mentioning about how leafy greens, we've been hearing it for the past, 5, 6, 7 years about E. coli contamination of leafy greens. I think the common person, I didn't know what was the cause of it. We would try to Google, we'd look at it, okay, contaminated water, but what is the actual root cause? The root cause is that you have cattle farms right next door to farms producing leafy greens. And that type of land use, who's regulating that? Nobody knows. You talk to the USDA, the FDA, nobody is regulating this kind of stuff. And this is the problem. And the problem is that a lot of these regulations are also very outdated, like decades, if not 100 plus years old. And that is such a huge problem. And that was really eye-opening to me because, just watching some of the stories, it was really hard to watch, the families and some of these kids who died. And there was this one girl who got E. coli poisoning from eating romaine lettuce in a salad, and she survived miraculously. And that was really hard to watch because it's this girl just had a salad. And I think a lot of people don't realize that E. coli how deadly it can be. It can cause hemorrhaging, and it basically, causes severe organ damage. So this particular strain that I think it was 0157 that was found to be found to be a contaminant in leafy greens, and initially in ground beef with the outbreak in 1992-1993 involving hamburger meat. So it's just why is this stuff still happening? And I really commend people like Bill Marler, the attorney who, has been doing this work for 30 years. He was at the helm of the E. coli outbreak in hamburger meat. And what he actually accomplished was he was able to get E. coli 0157, that's particular strain, to be deemed an adulterant. So it basically means that it is banned, it should not be found in food. So that was a great win on his part. And he's trying to do the same thing with salmonella now, I believe. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the whole point is that things like land use, regulating, and then also salmonella in chicken, that was a huge thing in the documentary too. It's you have USDA inspectors, but they're not really doing anything. I think they were saying that they just visually inspect the meat, if even that, going across the line. And that's based on 100 years ago, where they didn't know about pathogens. They didn't know about bacteria and viruses, right? So they would just inspect meat by looking at it, if it looks good or it looks bad, whatever that means. So they're not doing proper, microbiological testing and things like that. So it's just so, I wouldn't even say it's complicated. I just think it's just so much negligence and just so much why are the systems so outdated, and why, and then the lobbyists, right? You just have so many things going on. The peanut story, that dude that was sentenced for 28 years. Oh my God. Like, he knew that his plant had like mouse infestations, and yet he just turned a blind eye. And it was just, anyway, there was a lot there to unpack, but a lot of the stuff was hard to watch, especially like the actual kids that were affected and the families and stuff like that. So yeah, I could go on and on, but it was a really great documentary, and it was very eye-opening. Again, like, all of this stuff we've heard about, but like, no one really talks about the root causes, and this is what the documentary delved into, and that was really important.
Well, maybe more action will be done now that, so many people are watching this documentary.
I wonder, because they got the FDA, they got the USDA to be in the documentary, actually. But again, they were it just made them look really bad, because they had nothing to say. They were, oh, well, we can't comment on that. We can't do anything about that. Stuff like that. So I'm surprised that they agreed to be in it.
Yeah.
Because it just made them look really bad. I do hope so, because I'm thinking of actually writing a letter to Congress or whoever it is in the US, even though I'm in Canada, be like, yeah, who is regulating land use? Why are there cattle farms next to produce farms? Why is this happening?
Did they, I think there is that problem too of the FDA and the USDA like partially sharing responsibility for ensuring a safe food system. And did they go into the history of that at all? Because I think that's interesting, like how that came to be that there's two regulatory bodies for this sort of one overall thing.
From my recollection, I don't know if they went into too much of like the history of them working together. The only things that they touched on really is that the USDA regulates like meat, like beef and poultry and eggs, and then the FDA regulates everything else. And there was probably some sort of agreement a while back that that said that. But Aisha, did you remember anything else that they touched on? No,
they on that.
I don't remember the particulars of it, but there's another podcast that I've plugged on this podcast before called Maintenance Phase that talks all about like the food system in the US and like a lot of the stuff. And they had an episode on recalls, and they had actually gone into like what's the deal with like why do we have USDA and FDA, and does that make any sense anymore? Yeah, another interesting piece to this is that, you think of the FDA's role, and we talk about it on our other podcast, the Xtalks Life Science podcast a lot, is also to regulate, drugs. And I just did a quick, Google search for the FDA's budget for regulating those two areas. And in fiscal year 2022, their budget, 34% of their budget went towards their human drugs program. So that's the largest portion of their budget. Whereas the foods program came in second. That was 18% of their budget. So, quite a difference there. I know that's just like looking at the numbers on the surface, but from a priorities perspective, obviously seems like more of the money is going into drugs. And obviously there's different, maybe things cost more, in order to kind of like regulate those. Drugs tend to be more, complex, obviously, compared to food. But when you think about the importance of a safe food system, I think it's likely like a budgetary problem, maybe not knowing who's really responsible for what. I haven't seen the documentary, but you said it sounds like the people from FDA and USDA that were willing to speak on it just weren't able to infer a lot of like confidence in their roles. And so maybe it's just going to require a systemic kind of overhaul to address this stuff. What was the real sort of call to action at the end of the documentary? Like, do you think they're just wanting to build awareness that this is, a real problem and that nothing's really being done about it?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, the Bill Marler, he sort of ended it by saying that, after 30 years of doing this, he didn't really think it would still be an issue. But unfortunately, it still is. And while he's had like minor victories, that, to him, it's like not enough has been done or even close to have been done. So And yeah, I wouldn't say there were really like solutions that were put forward, because I think that like the solutions are a little too complex for just the average person to
and very
be able
political. Right?
Yes, extremely political
so
as well.
So that's the other piece. Well, that's the main piece. I would say.
Like if you didn't know that the representatives were from the USDA and the FDA, you would think they were like CEOs of businesses. They
or
felt
politicians,
to me, or politicians. Yeah, they felt to me like they were running a business, or they were running a city or a country, rather than which, you know, they're running sort of facets of a country, but they were very like politically and business minded, when they really should have been a lot more empathetic, I would say, like the lawyers were, and the victims' families and the victims were to the situation. So I wouldn't say like a solution was put forward, but I would say if more people, and hopefully a lot of people do watch it, you know, that call to action was just sort of, do the small things, like write to your, you know, local congressperson or whatever it may be, and sort of get them a little bit more involved too, because it seems to be overlooked, and it's very shocking. And it's sort of, I like the way that it ended. It sort of gave a couple like consumer suggestions as well. So, you know, if you're at a restaurant and you want to order a burger or anything beef, someone was just like, order it to temperature rather than say medium rare or rare, because that way you can really control it, you know, to the best of your abilities. And if they don't have a thermometer, order something else. And a lot of them steered clear completely of like leafy greens, bagged salads, things like that, because they don't,
especially bagged and packaged.
Because they don't trust
to buy
it.
like the whole head.
And sorry, why?
Yeah.
Why about the bag?
Well, a couple reasons. Sorry, what was your question specifically?
Why, like, not bagged salads or fruits?
Just because when they're bagged up, well, a couple of reasons. So often bagged salads, you'll have like lettuce or cabbage or carrots or whatever from various different places, so you don't know what the specific like contaminant could be. Yeah, exactly. The source is.
Trace. Yeah.
Whereas if you're buying a head of lettuce, it's like a head of lettuce, and there's no debate. It's all one unit, right? And then the other reason is that when they're sort of bagged, water can accumulate more easily, and it's just, it makes it more prone to like developing, I think,
it's like a better
illnesses,
environment
and that's
for those things to grow. Yeah.
Moisture and stuff. Yeah,
exactly. And then the third reason a lot of them will steer clear of leafy greens, as opposed to like beef, is that you don't typically cook leafy greens, so you can't really eliminate any foodborne illness. Whereas with beef or chicken, you can if you cook it to the proper temperature. Unfortunately, a friend of mine a couple years ago got salmonella from eating chicken that she undercooked, and she admits that she made the mistake. But luckily, she had a horrible week of being sick, but luckily it didn't impact her beyond that. And yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing about this documentary was just how serious foodborne illnesses are. Like, I really didn't think it was as serious as they were. They can be deadly, and that's so devastating, because like they're almost all preventable. And somewhere along the line, someone chose to be negligent or, choose profits over people's safety. And that was, really sad to see. But I hope a lot of people watch it. And not it didn't promote a message of like, we should be scared. It didn't
fear mongering or anything.
It wasn't fear mongering. It was just giving people facts and helping them make more informed choices. So I really appreciated that about the documentary.
And the thing with leafy greens is that the U.S. is the biggest exporter of leafy greens around the world. So all of us in Canada, we get all of our greens from the U.S. two specific places, Yuma, Arizona, and Salinas, California. And I noticed the Arizona because whenever I would pick up a head of lettuce, I'd be like, Arizona, like, isn't it like desert land? And so they do, obviously it's closer to California, so they do have land there conducive to that. But then again, they have like a cattle farm next door. And, like a lot of these producers, I'm not going to say all of them are like outright villains. Like peanut guy. Like that peanut guy wasn't a villain and beyond, but because he knew of what was going on. But, you know, it's just things do happen, but if your practices and if your regulations are so outdated and not addressing what, you know, the things that could happen, I think that's a big problem. So like in the case of like cattle farms next door to leafy green farms, like that shouldn't be happening and stuff like that.
You
so
can
I think
smell the farm, probably
right.
the cattle farm.
Right. And so I think the documentary did a really good job just to raise awareness. And I think that was the goal and of it. It was a little bit disheartening in terms of like there is still so much to do and there are a lot of hoops to jump, and we're up against a lot of big things, and it's not just corporate America, it's the government, the US government and lobbyists. I think those facets scare me more so just because of the sheer power that they have in not doing anything.
And well, you know, and I wonder if it's the same with food as it is with pharma. So like I had heard that FDA is really like that's okay. FDA is like really a revolving door for pharma. So oftentimes you'll see people, executives who worked for like a pharma company will then work for FDA, and maybe then they go back to another pharma company. And so there's like very obvious conflicts of interest there when you're thinking about sort of switching from a regulatory role with the government to being in a private business, you know? I wonder if it's the same thing with food. I wonder if it's people who work for the FDA, you know, have a history working for the manufacturers, and maybe there's still some ties there. You know what I mean? I'm not saying everyone's corrupt. I just think that there sometimes are even unintentional biases with that type of model.
Yeah, Sydney, wasn't there that scientist in the documentary conflict? That was an example of that. So basically, I forget, was it it was a specific company, food company, or was it the USD? Who was funding her research? I forget.
It was various, I think, like, I'm pretty sure it was
lobby
the US.
Groups, cattle farmers. I forget who exactly the groups were, but they had funded her research, and then now she is on the USDA. Is she? Where is she?
But like,
yeah, something like that. But again, so the documentary filmmaker asked her, was this like, is this not a conflict of interest? And then she was just sidestepping, like, well, no, you know, the grants came to the university and then they came to me and blah, blah, blah. I was like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I will say like one thing about that is that I truly think that one needs to have industry experience to know how to regulate the industry, if that makes sense. Like if people were just hired in the FDA straight out of college, which I'm sure some people are, right? And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying like, I think it's really valuable if one has industry experience and then they go into regulatory, because they know how the companies work inside and out. And I just think like, there's probably pros and cons we can talk about that, but I think like a lot of the people in the FDA have worked for food companies or pharma before they joined the FDA.
I think it's tough to tease out then their ties after the fact, just because they're no longer on the payroll of whatever food company. You know, what are their sort of obligations there to be providing a favorable regulatory environment for that company? Or maybe they want to be able to transition, you know, out of FDA back into another food company. There's like a lot of competing priorities here, and like it seems like the least of which is like general public safety, you know, for a safe food system. So
what are their motivations and interests?
Another question that comes up for me is, did they compare the U.S. food system to other countries, and are there other countries that are doing it better? That they think that there are some like key learnings there.
I don't recall. Yeah, no. They didn't. And but
I did think of that though as I was watching the documentary. Of course, a lot of Europe comes to mind, right? Because they have their regulations around food and drugs are known to be a lot stricter than in the US. So that came to mind. But then what also came to mind is like, okay, this is happening in the US. safest food in the world, like according to like everyone they spoke to, regulators and all that in the documentary. What's happening in like third world developing countries? I don't even want to know. It's like,
well, a lot of them don't even have clean water to drink, right? So.
Exactly. So I just like, this is, I think we really sometimes overlook just how important like the food supply chain and clean water and things like that are. So
not, we don't want to end this on a bleak note, but I do recommend people watch it and form their own opinions and take some maybe personal steps or steps in your life to sort of see what you can do about these things.
It's not
and
a plug for
others.
Netflix or anything like that. Just want to
no,
make clear,
they get enough free advertising, but awesome discussion though. Yeah. All right. Well, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Food Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thanks, everyone, and see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Xtalks Food Industry Podcast. If you enjoyed our discussions today, please share the episode with your friends and colleagues, and be sure to subscribe in order to be notified when a new episode is released. To join in on the discussion, you can find Xtalks on social media. Email podcast@xtalks.com or comment on the articles directly. Links are in the show description. Take a moment to join our community at xtalks.com to get access to everything we have to offer, including webinars, job listings, virtual meetings, articles, and more. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers sharing them. They should not be taken as professional advice and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.